Hi, this is John Tolbert. I'm lead analyst here at KuppingerCole, and today I'm joined by Sadrick Widmann of CDAS. Hi, Sadrick.
Hi, John. Warm welcome from my side. My name is Sadrick. I'm CEO from CIAS, the leading European identity and access management solution.
Well, welcome. Today, I think we'll talk about that consumer identity and access management market and some of the trends and innovations and developments that we've been seeing there. CIAM, as we call it, has been around for a good decade plus in many cases, and there are just more and more vendors getting into that market because it's a burgeoning market. There's a lot of need for solutions in that space. We've seen an increase in digitalization over the last few years, especially, in response to the pandemic. Everybody's doing business online. It's a requirement, really, to just stay ahead these days. So not only is it a requirement to have it, but we've seen the types of use cases that CIAM has to address just really expand a lot in the last few years. And one of the things that I thought we could talk about is the increasing need for verified identities on the consumer side. For a long time, when a new employee comes on board, there's an expectation, a need for proving that employee is who they are, to a certain degree. And of course, on the consumer side, that's been true for certain industries like finance, banking, where they have anti-money laundering laws and know your customer laws and regulations that have to be followed. But what we're seeing now is more of a need for that same kind of getting to know the customer for other industries, and they're looking to consumer identity and access management solutions for that. One example is the hospitality industry, where short-term rentals, they are wanting some proof of who's going to be staying in a property. So there's a little bit more to the registration process than there used to be. So how would you respond to all that, Sadrick? What are you seeing in the market? What are some of the emerging trends, especially around verified identities or anything related to that?
Yeah, I totally agree with you, John. So we also see a broad range of use cases for verified identities. So as you mentioned, starting from the regulatory environments like banks and insurances, where digital identity verification processes are important, for example, for opening an account or getting a loan. But also, as you mentioned, use cases for non-regulatory environments. So mobility, as you mentioned, renting an e-scooter, renting a car, but also van rentals, if you consider retailers where you can rent a van to transport the products just purchased. So there's a really broad range of different use cases where verified identities or the digital identity verification process itself is required. And I think it will grow, especially in the future, much more because the verification of a user and the identity of the user itself will be an integral part of the user identity in the future.
Yeah, definitely agree. One of the things I've noticed, as we're working on our update to the CIAM research, a lot of vendors either have or they're partnering with third-party service providers that make, what I would call like a remote onboarding application, usually mobile-based, sometimes web-based, and that can help with identity proofing. Sometimes they can read information from, say, the chip in a passport or a national ID card, over NFC. And then, they could read barcodes, with the camera, and then they even match the official picture on the document to a selfie. What sorts of capabilities are your clients looking for?
Our clients are mainly using an approach which is called AutoIdent. So that's basically a video stream which is analyzed by artificial intelligence, so automatically detecting the ID document, the features of the ID document, as well as the user and the face of the user, doing then a match, if possible, with the ID document image as well as the user. There are several reasons for that. One reason is NFC is quite comfortable, but not all documents provide an NFC chip or a barcode today. So this visual approach provides some flexibility to analyze or detect different ID documents. For example, driver licenses often don't have an NFC chip, so it will be hard to use these methods. So the AutoIdent approach itself is really a benefit. Other than that, the AutoIdent approach is quite convenient for the users. So it's not like the traditional video ident approach, where you have to talk to an agent, let's say opening a bank account 10 p.m. in the evening. You don't want to talk to a person for 10, 15 minutes. It's just more comfortable if you do an AutoIdent approach, hold your ID document, passport, ID card, driver license into the camera, smile, and then it's done. So that's much faster and much more convenient for the user then.
Yeah, I've also seen, and I'm aware of this kind of technology being used more and more for, what some would call the B2E, business to employee or workforce use cases. I mean, especially since the pandemic started, people have changed jobs. They don't necessarily go into an office to get a new badge. So, you can use the remote onboarding app the same way for bringing a new employee in as you would for signing up a new consumer for a bank site. Do you see the same kind of interest for workforce use cases too?
Yeah, definitely. So we see a tremendous rise in workforce use cases. As you mentioned, especially during the pandemic, it started. So nowadays, during the pandemic, the onboarding procedures just changed. So people are not coming on site for the onboarding, but it's more like off-site onboarding, where you have like complete digital process of signing up. After digital identity verification, configuring your authentication methods, login credentials, multi-factor options, as well as compliance processes, what you have to finish during the onboarding process. So we see a big race in that. Started from the pandemic, but also now onwards, where like this remote work is more in trend, and it's more required to identify the employees, but also in the context of partners, it's becoming more and more important. So if you have any suppliers, subcontractors, also there, it's quite interesting to identify the users and the persons working jointly with you.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, the working arrangements these days are far more complicated than they used to be too. So having ways to, say remotely bring on contractors and get some identity verification for that, I think is probably beneficial for everyone. Well, what trends do you see on the horizon for identity proofing in general, especially with regard to this, remote onboarding kind of capability?
Yeah, I think there will be different trends in that. One big trend will be that the onboarding or the process of digital identity verification in general will be even more comfortable for the user in future, because that's main competitive advantage of these processes. If it's comfortable, users will do it. If not, they will stop doing it. Additionally, I think there will be a race between attackers and providers of such services. Considering, for example, the AutoIdent approach with video streaming, their new attack patterns arise. For example, deepfakes and all that. Same attack patterns will arise in different other sectors. So also there, it will be a race in security features, what these processes will provide to really securely identify the identities. One big trend, what I am curious to see coming, is the reuse of verified identities. So if I consider myself opening a bank account, I will do a digital identity verification process, confirm it's me, Sadrick Widmann, and then in the next step, I want to apply for a loan. I don't need to do a new digital identity verification process. I can just reuse my verified identities in a later step, so maybe 2 months later when I apply for a loan. So I think the trend of reusing of verified identities, so the combination of the verified identity to a user account where I later can log in and reuse all the saved information, I'm quite curious to see how that will emerge in the future. So really acting as like a fully digital version of myself.
Yeah, I agree. If you can trust the process of the identification of the individual, that verification process, that event itself should be able to, be reused within, say, a certain period of time for similar use cases. Of course, there's, a bit of risk analysis. I would assume that most organizations are going to trust that already verified identity would want to go through. But yeah, anything that you can do to reasonably, reduce the friction. Onboarding experiences can be somewhat frictional, and I think as consumers, we all expect a certain amount of that. But if you can make it convenient and show the consumer that there's a value or a benefit for doing that, then I think it's something that is more easily accepted.
Yeah, correct. I think the combination of the time-based aspect as well as the risk-based analysis, what can be ensured. So if there's no suspicion, then a reuse might be possible, and then if not, a new process needs to be started. You're right.
So, we can say that we have seen, in my preliminary research at least, that there's much more need for identity proofing, across industries and places like I said, in hospitality. Some of the other trends that we see are around passwordless, or, making more and more use of what we'd call risk-based analysis for authentication. What do you see on the passwordless and risk-based authentication side?
I see a huge interest in that. So on both of the topics, taking the passwordless authentication, I see a huge benefit for the user comfort there, as well as for security. So considering the device biometrics, for example, that's already a well-known feature for most of the users. And I think it will provide a good user comfort. Additionally, I think the most common attack patterns are still brute force, phishing, and all that. So they're really focused on passwords. So passwordless authentications will also provide a real benefit in the security perspective. Considering our platform, we see more than 100,000 passwordless logins per week. So we already see a bigger number there. And I think that will be a tremendous increase in the coming month and in the coming year. Curious to see about that. Same is for the risk-based authentication. So we have a smart MFA functionality, which basically allows multi-factor risk-based. So when there's suspicious behavior, we'll ask for multi-factor. If there's no suspicious behavior, maybe a single factor will be sufficient. So that allows to combine, especially also the security and the user comfort in that perspective. And I think that's quite important because the user comfort is a preliminary for all the activities on certain platforms. So the balance between security and comfort is quite important. So both risk-based authentication as well as the passwordless authentication are really developments improving the user comfort and therefore providing a better convenience here. But I think there's also a few more things coming up there, which you're also focusing in your research, which are quite interesting for the future.
Yeah, I think I will focus on, at EIC talking about things like, improving the consumer experience. And, risk-based analysis is a real, I won't say easy, but at least it's something that's certainly addressed very, very well, I think, by CIAM platforms. It's just that many of the companies that buy these don't really fully deploy all the capabilities that these solutions have. And like you were saying, if there's not much change in the context of a request, then don't necessarily need to ask the consumer for an explicit multi-factor authentication event. I mean, because that in itself adds friction. That's something that might convince a consumer that this site, this company's too hard to deal with. I'll find somebody else that's easier. So you're right. Getting the amount of friction right using technologies like passwordless and risk-based authentication, I think, definitely need to be more fully utilized by companies and consumer-facing businesses today.
Yeah, I also think if we consider passwordless, if I remember, V2 had a webinar 2018 where we talked about our real-world identification feature. So also there, the goal is to connect the digital and the real-world identity. And considering the real-world identity, passwords are not a good use case because in the real world you might not use a password at any smart TV or anything. So there are other capabilities to authenticate there. And same is if you want to enter, for example, a stadium or enter like an event, you don't want to enter a password to authenticate yourself. You use other technologies or concepts like NFC, barcodes, QR codes, things like that to authenticate yourself. So there also the authentication is passwordless. So I think that's also a big trend then.
Yep, for sure. On the whole, I'd say CIAM is still a growth market and probably will remain a growth market for, the foreseeable future. So that means there's lots of opportunities for vendors in the space, lots of room for improvement by consumer-facing businesses that are adopting it. What do you foresee as growth in the market? And how would you help customers that are getting into it to get the most out of their CIAM solution?
Yeah. So first of all, yeah, you're completely right. So CIAM is definitely a growth market. We see many of the customers we are interacting with who are just starting with the CIAM, with CIAM platforms itself. So there are many companies out there which didn't start in the field of identity and access management, at least not for customers. So there's a real big group of companies which didn't had any starting point with that on the area. So it's a real growth market. We support in particular B2B and B2C use cases. So starting from an extensive set of authentication options, including MFA methods for the B2B use cases, then also group management or self-administration capabilities where our customers provide their customers, which are then B2B. So companies or partners interacting there with a capability to manage their users on the customer portals. But also privacy-related topics are quite features which are often used by our customers. So in the context of GDPR, the advanced consent management, so agreeing to terms of use, consenting to transferring the information, the user data or other data to partners or subcontractors. So different use cases where privacy is in place. So we see many use cases where we can support our customers, and we are happily pushing them forward. I also mentioned the real-world identification. So innovative features like that are quite often used for accessing, as mentioned, stadiums, for example, in the context of soccer or football. So there are really a broad range of use cases where our customers are utilizing our platform, and we are happy to push that forward in the future and seeing the CIAM market to grow further and providing good user experience to end users.
That's interesting because I think you bring up a good point there too about, sometimes we think too rigidly about B2C, B2E. There are a lot of B2B2C kinds of use cases, or just even, business to business, kinds of customer arrangements that sort of fall into this middle ground between regular IAM and CIAM. And, the subject you're bringing up there too about what I'd call physical access controls, that's something that might have been more traditionally on the workforce side, letting employees into buildings, but letting ticket holders into sports events or other events.
Correct.
I think it's a really interesting crossover cases, and I think that really illustrates that there's huge growth potential here by combining these technologies and using the best of both to solve more and more kinds of use cases.
Yeah, I agree. So I think especially there are many use cases or traditional use cases where single sign-on, multi-factor, and authentication is important, and then the use cases become more and more complex, extending to all different areas, including physical access. And I think that's also makes it quite interesting to see how the market develops in the future.
Yeah, definitely. Well, great. Thanks for joining me today, Sadrick. This is a really interesting conversation.
Thanks for having me today. Was, as always, great to speak to you, and hopefully see you soon.
Yes, thank you. Thanks, everyone, for watching.
Thanks.